Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Welcome to Thursday, July 9th. Man, we are getting close to the end of this class. We're going to be taking the second exam this weekend, and wow, that's 6 out of 8 weeks done. How's everybody feel so far about the class? Are you having a good time? Good morning, Alex. Good morning, Ashley. Good morning, KB. Good morning, Donnie. Good to see everybody. I hope you're having as much fun this summer as I am, right? So we're going to continue on with our lecture on stress today. Okay, remind me at the end of the class to make a couple of comments about the exam, okay? Just some preparatory comments. So without further ado, everybody can hear me. Sounds good, right? Everybody can hear me? Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and assume so, and let's just carry on with our lecture. So today we're going to be talking about health and well-being. We're going to be talking again about stress. So everybody can hear me well. Fantastic. All right, cool. So stress is not the feeling of stress is different from stressors, and the feeling of stress is not a foregone conclusion. It all depends on qualities that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about positive psychology as an approach to treating stress and making people happier. We're going to talk about what causes the feelings of stress, different coping strategies that people use, and we're going to talk about qualities of you and your environment that buffer you against stress. Okay? Let's go ahead and get started. Positive psychology. Now, we talked about health psychology the other day. Health psychology is an area of specialization. So there are health psychologists out there. Now, some health psychologists may focus on biological qualities related to health. Other health psychologists might focus on behavioral reinforcement kind of qualities that relate to overall health. We're going to talk about positive psychology. And really, these people are interested in in approaching psychology that focuses on the scientific study of what it is that makes people happy. So we're just going to focus on happiness, or as we talked about the other day, well-being. So positive psychology is an approach to psychology that focuses on happiness from a scientific point of view, right? So we're going to talk about factors such as positive emotion and pleasure, being engaged in life, and finding meaning. These are sort of qualities of happiness and well-being that people measure. Now, there are international studies of people's well-being, and in fact, our country does a 6-item study of well-being as well every year. And so governments are now interested in well-being as a measure of the people. You can look at GDP, but that's only one measure of how happy of how good your society is doing, how well your society is doing. Happiness and whether or not people feel good about themselves is also an important quality. Now, if you look at our map, you'll notice that North Carolina, we're sort of in the middle for well-being. Notice that there are some states that are in the lower part of well-being. So look at Florida, for example. Why might Florida be lower on well-being? Well, if you think about it, Florida's going to have an older population, so maybe people down there are more sick, and that might add into their feelings of lack of well-being, right? And you'll see it looks like up in the Midwest and upper North Midwest part of the country is where the happiest, most well-being people are. Right? Now, if you look over here on the right, they've got the survey of the happiest countries in the world. Well, the good news is we're not worst, but the bad news is we're not first. And what they do is they actually track what kinds of qualities are factoring into people's evaluations of how happy they are. So you see money factors into it, social support factors into it, health factors into it, freedom factors into it, and generosity, and everything else. So you can actually parcel out what kinds of things feed into people's feelings of happiness. Now, why is this important? Well, well-being, positive emotion, engagement in life, and finding meaning is actually a very strong predictor of your immunity level. You're going to be less sick if you have a positive well-being, and you're actually going to live longer. When I talk about my developmental psych class, one of the things that developmental psychologists are interested in is parceling out what causes people to die. So how much of your likelihood of your age of death and your health is due to your genetic qualities, and how much is due to environmental factors. And you know what? It turns out when it comes to dying, environment and health behaviors are really more important than genetic factors, right? So learning how to cultivate this feeling of well-being is very important for us as human beings and allows us to live longer, more successful lives. I don't know if you folks remember from the developmental psych class when I was talking about the rectangularization of the death curve and average lifespans. In 1900, the average lifespan in the United States was 47 years of age. Now it's at 80 years of age. What figures into that? Well, scientifically studying well-being and the factors that lead into that. Everything else, okay, yes, that's a good point. If we go back to this graph, you'll see, everything else is a big part of what predicts happiness. But one way you can think of it is you can think, and this is sort of perspective, KB, you can say, wow, we don't know 40% of what predicts how happy people will be in their sense of well-being. This is true. Maybe we can't predict 40, but we can predict 60, right? So if you think about it, even though we can't tell you exactly 100% what factors into intelligence, KB, the more I can answer for, the more I can explain, the better off we can be at maybe cultivating this sort of happiness. Good point, though. Always the critic there, KB. I like you. You're a scientific critic. Nice. Okay? So here's the deal. Stress is actually a mental construction. If you remember from Chapter 9, we talked about emotions as being is still a chance of showers. There you go. Okay, KB. I like the way you put it. Here's the deal, though. If you remember when we talked about Chapter 9, I suggested to you that the final emotional experience didn't just depend upon your amygdala and your basic fear responses, but it was an interplay between your amygdala and your frontal lobe, helping you to understand why things are happening, your sensory cortices, which allow you to reevaluate these sensations that you're experiencing, to reinterpret them. So I suggested to you that your final emotion isn't just a physiological response, my amygdala firing up, but it's also part of your mental structure. You have a sort of a slow, thoughtful process to emotions. Here's the deal. Stress is an emotional response. So just like any other emotion, we do have physiological arousal, but it all depends on how we interpret that arousal as to whether or not we experience the final emotion of stress. Does that make sense? So it's not just what happens to you in what happens to your amygdala, but it's how your frontal lobe interprets the emotional signals that your amygdala is giving you, right? So let's think of this in two ways. Probably the one guy that, this guy named Richard Lazarus sort of explained it best way back in the 60s. He argued that you can think of stress as occurring in a two-step process. All right, first, the amygdala tells us whether or not something is threatening, challenging, or neutral, right? So we make a primary appraisal. Your boss comes in and tells you that they're downsizing at work, and you have to make the judgment. Wow, what does that mean? Is that threatening, challenging, or neutral? You make the primary appraisal. Now, if it's neutral, it doesn't cause stress. If it's threatening or challenging, you then go to a second step, which is where we make the judgment, do I have the resources to deal with this particular threat or challenge? If the answer is yes, then you still don't experience stress. The deal is when you perceive something as a threat and you also perceive yourself as unable to meet that threat or challenge. And this is why some people can live in these incredibly busy lives where they're doing this and doing that and meeting this challenge and having this competition, and they don't feel a bit of stress at all. And then other people have difficulty dealing with even the smallest challenges. It's all in what happens during that secondary appraisal process. Well, in the primary appraisal too, whether or not you see something as a challenge or a threat, right? But these two kinds of appraisal strategies determine whether or not something is finally stressful. So some of you get stressed out so easy. Some of you are tough as a rock, right? Which one are you? Do you get stressed out really easy, or are you stress proof? Can anybody type in the chat bar and let me know? I'd be curious to see, right? You know, my mom used to be so stressed out. She was retired. My mom and dad had a steady income of money coming in, right? No worries there. And they had a house, and my mom every day would tell me, Chris, I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. And I was like, what the hell kind of challenges do you have, Mom? And yet she felt a sense of threat. And then other people may run 2 companies and have a part-time job and 4 kids and still don't feel stress, right? So Ashley, stressed out easily. Well, a little bit of both. That's okay. Hopefully you can take something away from today's lecture, Ashley, which will help you be less stressed in the future. Now, so really the way to think about this is it's not just the stressors. See the graph there at the bottom? It's not just the stressors. Remember I suggested to you yesterday we have big challenges, and then we all have these daily niggling problems that keep driving at us, right? It's not necessarily the stressors, but what really determines whether or not you get stressed out or not are what we'll call mediating factors. And we're going to talk about these today. Your coping strategy, which is affected by your personality, and also the social conditions that you find yourself in. So these 3 qualities can provide either protective or risk factors that will affect how susceptible you are to stress. And remember, the idea is we want to avoid chronic stress because that physiological response doesn't care what you're thinking about, right? It's still doing harm to you. If that cortisol is running around through your system, it's harmful. What we want to learn how to do is to use our mental facilities to counter that physiological process. So your amygdala gets lit up when your boss says you're downsizing. Your frontal lobe can say, hey, that doesn't affect me, or I'll be able to deal with it. Or you can say, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job and lose my family. And those 2 different responses are then going to create that feedback loop of chronic stress. So it's these mediating factors, these ways of thinking about the world that protect you from the final stress experience. And remember, we want to avoid chronic arousal, right? So coping strategies, we all have coping strategies that we use to respond to threats. See, Donnie doesn't get stressed very often. Maybe he has some good coping strategies, right? So coping is any kind of conscious effort that you engage in to solve problems in order to minimize the feeling of stress that you're having and the conflict that occurs in your environment. We'll call these coping. Now, it turns out there are tons of studies and tons of different names for different types and shades of coping strategies. I'm going to talk about Richard Lazarus because he was the first one to really talk about coping strategies. And he kind of suggested sort of 4 broad categories of how people cope with problems. Your book really just talks about the first 2, but I'm going to add the 3rd and 4th just to sort of round it out, right? So one way you can deal with a problematic marriage, or let's talk about, not a marriage, I'm going back to relationships. Let's talk about school. Let's say you're failing your psych class, right? One way to deal with that is to fix the problem. If you're in a broken marriage, you can fix the problem. If you don't have enough money, you can get a part-time job. So problem-based focusing is actually using your resource. He calls it resource problem-based focused coping, which is where you take your resources in and address the problem. And that's a great way to deal with your problems. But some problems are harder to fix. Some problems can be dealt with in other ways. So he talks about emotional focused coping. And this is what we do is when we just try to temporarily manage the feelings associated to the stressor. Instead of fixing the stressor, removing the stressor in problem-focused coping, we try to ameliorate the emotional response to the stressor. I see Renee just dropped in and said good morning. Good morning to you too, Renee. I hope we have a good crowd here today. Looks like we've got, so far, wow, looks like we've got 8 people watching. Everybody, how are you? Fantastic. It's good to see everybody. So one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try to temporarily so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try to so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try to so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way you can do it is remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way you can remove the stressor, or the second way is to try so one way to distract yourself. Second way 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 so one way to distract yourself. Hello. Did that fix the audio problem? Did that fix the audio problem? Is that better? I don't know what happened. My finger must have been over the browser, and I'll bet I clicked on it. How long was I out for? Crap. Okay. Cool. The last 3 minutes. Okay. So we've got coping strategies. Problem-faced coping is when you directly face the stressor and try to remove it. Emotion-focused coping is when you try to deal with the temporary emotions produced by the stressor. And we can do this by just pretending it's not there, which sometimes we do when somebody treats us rude. You just ignore the rude behavior. Sometimes we distract ourselves by thinking about something else. Or I was suggesting to you that I engage in meditation. I practice meditation. And one of the kinds of meditation that I practice with this guy here at Chautauqua is called the loving kindness meditation, which is where you spend 20 minutes thinking good thoughts about somebody you absolutely hate. It's an interesting strategy, and it turns out it makes you feel a lot better after you finish meditating this way. Super weird. Now, your book's going to talk about problem-based and emotion-focused coping. Which one's better? It depends. It depends on the situation. Temporary problems, sometimes it's better just to manage the emotions. Failing a psych class, problem-focused coping would probably be better, right? And so people sort of don't use one or the other, but they use a blend. And the idea is to use successful coping strategies as rather than non-coping strategies. So Lazarus also mentioned support seeking. So, you know, how many of you talk to your friends about your problems? I do. Men aren't as good at it as females are, but we talk to our spouses, our significant others, about our problems. And that support seeking acts as a buffer and allows us to cope with stress. And then I know a ton of people, I don't know if they really believe this, but if you listen to people on Facebook, their problems are always happening for a reason and making them grow as a person. And that's the way they deal with stressors, right? Now here's the deal. Some people engage in what we would call non-coping or maladaptive coping strategies. So you can avoid problems or escape from problems that really need to be dealt with. You know, some people choose to start skipping psych class when they're not failing it. Of all the strategies, that escape strategy is not going to fix your failing grade. How many of you have ever done that? You've been in a class, you're not doing well, so suddenly you don't go to class, right? You find reasons to be sick, reasons to be late, reasons not to do it. I see it happen to students all the time. And this makes them feel better in the short term, but it is a non-coping strategy, right? Some people engage in coping and safety behaviors. They eat too much, they drink too much, they engage in codependent relationships. So they engage in behaviors that sort of make them feel better in the short term. And you know what? Some people just lie to themselves. I'm not failing that psych class. I don't have a drinking problem. This isn't a problematic relationship that I'm in. And so the idea is that you need to learn to use a mix of coping strategies, problem and emotion-focused coping, depending upon the situation, while trying to avoid these non-coping strategies of picking up habitual behaviors or lying to yourself or avoiding tough situations, right? And then at the bottom here, I tell you that people's choices of coping strategies may be a product of their personalities. All right, so there are three broad areas of research I want to talk about. These are personality styles that have been shown to be related to the feelings and the impacts of stress. The earliest was the type A personality in the early 60s. And what they found is that heart patients with a certain personality style tended to have more problems and more heart incidents later than people with this type B personality. And they found that this type A personality seemed to involve a bunch of traits, but I'm going to boil it down to three broad categories. Type A people were sort of impatient all the time. They were super competitive and focused on achievement and getting gold stars. And they were kind of aggressive, angry people. Anybody know a type A personality? And what they found is that these people tended to have more heart trouble than did people who had what's known as the laid-back type B personalities. Later research has found, honestly, that the most important of these three personality styles is a hostile personality style. So you know what? I'm super impatient. I promise you that. I'm super competitive. I promise you that. But I don't think I'm quite as hostile as the typical type A personality. And so what research has found is that it's really this hostility that has the worst response to stress and leads to the most physical difficulties. this lady named Suzanne Cabasa in the 70s was interested in why business executives got sick. Business executives, CEOs, these other people get up and work from morning to night making high-profile, high-pressure decisions where businesses and jobs, even their own, exist and can disappear at a moment's notice. These people are under a ton of stress. And she wanted to figure out what made the business executives sick. What sort of factors determined which business executives would succumb to the stress and which business executives didn't. And she found that there were sort of different mindsets that predicted whether or not they were going to avoid these negative effects. The people with, and she called this personality style psychological hardiness. And she said people who were psychologically hardy were really committed to what they were doing. I don't know how many of you are really committed to your educational path, to what it is you want. But the more commitment you feel, the more hardy she found you to be. You know what? There's a different way to see things. You can see things as challenges or threats. And she found that hardy people see things as challenges. For example, this spring, we had to move all of our seated classes to an online model. There were two responses from my faculty members. Some saw it as the worst thing that could ever possibly happen, and some of us thought, wow, this will be a cool experiment to try. Some of us saw it as challenges, some of us saw it as threats. And I'm sad to say, a lot more teachers saw this as a threatening event than a challenging event. And you know what? People who are psychologically hardy also have this feeling of control, that they can control their outcomes. If you'll remember, when we go back to the Lazarus model, the secondary appraisal is dependent upon how much control you think you have. So Suzanne Cabasa found that people with a high sense of commitment, a tendency to view things as challenges, not threats, and people who had a sense of control tended to display this quality she called psychological hardiness. Are any of you psychologically hardy? Do any of you sort of hear those descriptions and say, yeah, that's me? Right? Now, finally is the concept of learned optimism. Actually, this guy, Martin Seligman, was actually studying this thing called learned helplessness. That was sort of a behavioral concept when he stumbled on learned optimism. It turns out that if you shock dogs or animals and give them a bar to press and the bar doesn't do anything to stop the shocks, after a while they'll develop this condition called learned helplessness. And if you put them in a box where they can escape the shocks by jumping over a little wall, these dogs that have been trained for learned helplessness will sit there in the box and just whine while you shock them, even though they can easily jump out of the box and get away from the pain. And he found that some animals, and when he did these kind of experiments with college students, he found that there were some people who seemed to be immune to developing learned helplessness. So he became interested in this opposite quality he called learned optimism. And I hear you, Ashley's got some psychological hardiness. Fist bump for you, lady. And he found that the difference between people who were learned optimists, who had learned optimism, and those people who didn't, was in how they viewed the successes and failures of their lives. So they found that people with learned optimism, when they had success, they saw it as permanent. When they had failure, they saw it as impermanent, right? When they had success, they saw it as something that ran through their life as a general quality. They were successful. And they saw failure as being non-pervasive, just I'm failing right here in this, I'm failing right here in this. Whereas people who didn't have that seemed to focus on their losses and their failures as being pervasive. You know what? I fail in everything. And he found that people, learned optimists, didn't take failure so personally. Right? And so really what you can do is you can learn to interpret your failures and losses. How many of you, when you fail, you go, see, it happened again. Nothing good ever happens for me. If you do, you're not being showing learned optimism. You need to do that, right? On the other hand, some of you said, man, you know what? I failed. Like that mistake I had earlier with my sound, I already don't care about it. I done moved on, baby. This lecture's getting better every moment, right? And so what he found is that you can really train people to develop a sense of to develop their sense of learned optimism. You know what? I'm not going to talk about the ABCDE model because we're running out of time. I'll talk about that tomorrow in lab class, but that won't be on the exam. Okay. Finally, the other mediating factor is social support, right? And so good relationships with other people do two things for you. You know what? They give you help. One of the reasons people feel stressed out is because they're overwhelmed by the things they have to do. Having somebody there, having a partner to help you, provides the decrease in stressors that leads to lower stress, right? Number one, you got to get rid of the stressors. And the second big advantage of good relationships is it's somehow protective to know that other people care. Remember, we'll go back to chapter 4 with this idea of attachment. We all need that close supporting base at some times. And your research suggests that marriage, or let's say chronic bonding, I don't want to seem like I'm making value judgments. I am married and have been for a long time. But really, having a long-term relationship is probably the most important thing you can do to your health. If you look at your this graph up here, you'll see that married people seem to have their lowest level of reporting that they're in fair or poor health. So fewer of them are going to report feeling poorly and sick. So good marriages do provide a buffer against poor health. However, kind of an ironic thing is it's good marriages. Bad marriages actually are not good. So, you know, there's the question, should I just stay married just to be married? No, you should stay in a good marriage to be married. Bad marriages and divorced or bereaved singles still have compromised immune systems. So no, bad marriages are not necessarily good for you. But a good relationship can provide a buffer against the negative effects of stress. And you know what? Spirituality. It turns out in older adulthood, when you start talking about people's spirituality, you find that people who are spiritual report more well-being. And you know what? It doesn't depend on the religion, Buddhist, Jewish, Islamic, Christian, whatever. It's just this spirituality seems to provide a buffer against stress. Why? You know what? There are always people at your religious events. One of the things that tends to affect people older in late adulthood is disengagement, social disengagement. So church or religious service give you a place to go and see around and be around other people. Typically, most religions are going to promote healthy behaviors. And yes, absolutely, it gives you a sense of meaning. That was my third point. Absolutely. Spirituality gives you a sense, a way to explain the things that happen in life, to give yourself a focus, a reason for living, and a point to go to. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit of time, but you know what? Your book on page, KB, you can probably figure this out quicker than me. Nope, I can't believe I just picked it out of my... No, I didn't. I thought I had it. Okay. Right here on page 455 and 456, your book talks about several strategies that can keep you healthy. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to my Nana, my grandmother, who is 100 years old. She was 100 years old this spring. This crazy lady still lives on her own. She is independent. She does not have a caretaker. She gets up, feeds, and takes care of herself all day long. She actually manages a couple of real estate properties, and she drove to her 100th birthday party. This woman is an ass kicker, right? Let me tell you. Now, here's the deal. Your longevity is more dependent upon your behavior than your genetics. So what would my grandma tell you to do in order to live to 100? Well, I'm going to rephrase the statements on page 455 and 456 in Nanaism's terms. So the first thing she would tell you is you got to eat your greens, right? Healthy diet is very, very important. You know what? She always told me, Chris, you get one piece of pie. Right? So you're going to want to watch your portion control. Some people eat out of anxiety and they'll eat a whole bag of potato chips. You only get one piece of pie, right? Now, she always told me, don't you fool with that liquor, boy. Well, you know, Nana's a little old school in her attitude, but I would tell you that if you are going to drink alcohol, drink it in moderation. And actually, they say beer and red wine are way more healthy for you than grain spirits. So don't you fool with that liquor. Of course, Nana always told me, don't you be smoking, boy. And you know what? That's good. Either way, there's no moderation in smoking. And in fact, I would even add to that, really, if you can, try to get off the vaping too. Right? Okay. She also said, no fooling around. Again, Granny was kind of old school in that way. What she meant was you need to protect your sexual health, right? So, as the book says, and it even has a section on practicing safe sex, you need to keep in mind that the physical illnesses that you get from engaging in irresponsible sex will have an impact on your well-being and your life, right? Now, she also told me, boy, you need to find yourself a bingo league, right? You know what I would say? She just meant you needed to find some way to learn to relax. So what's your bingo league? Do you like to play soccer? Do you like a book club? What is it that allows you to relax? So if you can't think of anything, join yourself a bingo league, right? She said also, don't run from your troubles, right? So here's the deal. That means learn to cope. Just like your book says, learn to cope. You can't run from your troubles, boy. And she was right. So you can't get away from the stressors. You just have to learn happier ways to cope, right? She also said, get yourself outside. I skipped that one. You know what? Nana worked in a garden her entire life. You know, she actually worked at the Forestry Service when she was 90, cleaning up around the area. She used to work in the old folks' home, and she told me, or in the retirement center, and she used to say, yeah, I like to help the old folks. This was when she was in her 80s. So she got herself outside. You need to stay active, stay active, stay active. She said, find you somebody, honey. And you know what? That's true. The Beatles were right. All you need is love, and you need to find a group, a partner, some sort of cohesive unit that helps act as a buffer against stress. She used to tell me, y'all, you better go to church, boy. You better go to prayer meeting. And you know what? What your book's going to suggest is finding a sense of spirituality is going to help you live a healthier life, experience more well-being, and live longer. And you know what? She used to tell me, boy, it takes more muscles to frown than it does to smile, right? So what that means is you really need to learn how to practice being happy. You really need to practice being happy. There is actually, let me show it to you real quick. Oh, goodness me. I wanted to show you. I've got a couple of videos that I do want you to take a look at that I think you're going to find super duper interesting. Right here, let's see, in the chapter resources folder. What does it say? Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. So what I'd like for you to do is to, oh, crap. Well, at any rate, I had it and then I lost it because I did too much clicking around. At any rate, I've got two videos that I think you really need to watch if you want to learn how to deal with stress and be happy. Both of them are by the social psychologist Dan Gilbert, who studies in a positive psychology tradition. And he suggests that the way to be happy is to learn to cultivate this thing called synthetic happiness. And so what you need to learn how to do is to be happy when you don't get what you want. And so my grandma would tell you that you need to put a smile on your face, all right? Because it takes more muscles to frown than it does to smile. Also, I want you to watch Dan Gilbert's Happiness, What Your Mother Didn't Tell You, to discover the 3 eternal secrets to happiness, right? And so what I want you to realize, what I want you to take away from this lecture is that all of our lives have stress. What determines whether or not you are going to experience the negative effects of stress is how you choose to make that secondary appraisal. Can I handle it? Can I handle it? And there's some personality styles you need to cultivate in order to buffer yourself from stress, okay? We need to learn how to become resilient, right? We need to learn good coping strategies. We need to relax and slow down, right? And we also need to build a community of people through church, through activities, and engage in health behaviors. And if you can do all of these things, it's going to help you deal more effectively with stress and live a happier, healthier life. You know what, KB, not to pick on you, but since you've had the heart attack, you of all people would probably agree with me that you really need to take care of your health if you want to keep that old ticker clicking, right? Okay. Does anybody have any questions? I am sorry about the audio problem in the middle of the talk. I have no idea what I touched on. My fingers sometimes move around nervously on the keyboard as I'm lecturing, so I goof that up. Folks, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow in class. If you can't make it to the webinar at 10 a.m., remember to do the discussion board. Oh, thank you, Donnie. Just remember, it's going to be 12 questions per chapter. It's going to become available tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. It will be available through Monday night at 11:59 p.m. And I am available for test questions throughout the week. Does anybody want to have a test review Sunday night? And by the way, a lot of people really get challenged and threatened by exams, and I understand that because some of your teachers do use exams to punish you, and it's weird. There are some teachers who seem to get an enjoyment out of watching students do poorly. That is not me at all, okay? This is, instead of a test of your intellect, this is a challenge, is the way I look at this class. And so we will make sure, I'm going to make sure that the grades turn out okay for you. So there will probably be a small curve at the end of this class. I promise I'm going to take care of you. Now, if you don't meet basic requirements, you will not pass this class. But I am not designing this class to fail you. Instead, I'm designing this class to help you grow as a human. Okay? Donnie, which one do you think? Would you prefer to come to it on YouTube and type your questions right here and have me lecture? Or would you rather come and have a meeting in Teams? Teams. Okay. First vote is the winning vote. I guess that's how we'll do it here. All right, folks, take care. I am so sorry for keeping you late today. Have a great day. I will see you tomorrow don't forget to watch the video. I will see you in class tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. If not, do the discussion board. Otherwise, I will see you for the review session. I will send you a time later today. It'll probably be 7 or 8 o'clock on Sunday night. All right? Take care.